Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. We're about to unearth a story history books chose to forget, a case so disturbing it was deliberately erased from official records. Before we continue, leave a comment below to let us know where you're following us on this journey through the darkest corners of America's past. In the late 1870s, the Appalachian Mountains held secrets that should never come to light. Amidst the deep valleys and dense forests of West Virginia, a series of macabre events began to transform quiet villages into nightmarish landscapes. This is the story of Abel Knox, a 37-year-old man whose existence would become synonymous with terror in an era when the law barely reached the most remote corners of the mountains. The Appalachian region at that time was a world apart. Isolated communities lived separated by miles of precarious trails, where communication between settlements could take days. Pocahontas County, West Virginia, was one of those places forgotten by progress. Its mountains reached altitudes of over 4,000 feet, covered in forests so dense that even under the midday sun, darkness reigned between the trees. It was the territory of hunters, loggers, and farmers who lived off the land with little contact with the outside world. Abel Knox arrived in the region in the fall of 1876. No one knew for sure where he came from, though some swore they had seen him years earlier working in Kentucky slaughterhouses. He was a burly man with broad shoulders and huge hands, with a dark beard that hid most of his face. His eyes, those who knew him said, had something unsettling, a coldness that made people look away. He settled on a secluded property in Greenbrier Valley, where he set up a small meat processing business. The location was strategic, close enough to 3 different villages to attract customers, yet far enough away to maintain his privacy. The first few months passed without incident. Knox was discreet, spoke little, and performed his work with unsettling efficiency. Local farmers began seeking him out to slaughter and process their animals. They said he had exceptional skill with knives and worked quickly and cleanly, but there was something about him that bothered them. Some customers commented on the strange smell coming from his property, a sweet, nauseating odor that didn't quite match what one would expect from a regular butcher shop. Others mentioned the sounds that echoed at night from the valley where Knox lived, metallic clangs and heavy banging that lingered until dawn. In the winter of 1877, the first disappearances began. A traveler named Thomas Wardell, approximately 42 years old, vanished without a trace while crossing the region. Wardell was a hardware dealer and regularly traveled that route. Witnesses in the village of Hillsborough confirmed that he had set off toward Greenbrier Valley, carrying his suitcase of samples and about $50 in cash. He never reached his destination. Weeks later, a logger named Jacob Brennan, 35, disappeared after mentioning he was going to buy meat on Knox's property. His wagon was found abandoned 2 miles from the butcher shop, the horses still harnessed and nervous, but no sign of Brennan. Local authorities were virtually non-existent. The Pocahontas County Sheriff, an elderly man named William Driscoll, covered an area of thousands of square miles with only 2 deputies. Investigating disappearances in the mountains was a nearly impossible task. People disappeared all the time, victims of accidents, wild animals, or simply deciding to start a new life elsewhere. Driscoll asked a few routine questions, but without bodies or clear evidence, there was little he could do. Knox denied seeing any of the missing people, and in the absence of proof, the case was dropped. But the disappearances didn't stop. In the spring of 1878, 3 more people vanished near Greenbrier Valley. 2 were lone travelers. The third was a local farmer who had mentioned to his wife that he was going to settle accounts with Knox for a service he had performed months earlier. The community began to whisper. At meetings in local churches and in the few taverns in the area, Abel Knox's name began to be spoken with growing trepidation. Some residents avoided his property, preferring to take long detours on their journeys. Others, braver or more desperate, continued to do business with him. After all, he was the only competent butcher for miles around. What no one knew was that, locked in a barn at the back of his property, Knox harbored secrets that defy human comprehension. This place, hidden from the view of any casual visitor, had become the center of something unspeakable. And as 1878 progressed towards summer, events were about to reach a point of no return. The summer of 1878 brought sweltering heat to the mountains of West Virginia. Temperatures exceeded 30 degrees Celsius, unusual for that altitude, and the humidity made the air heavy and difficult to breathe. It was during this period that rumors about Abel Knox began to gain more depth, fueled by disturbing observations from those who dared approach his property. A farmer named Henry Caldwell, who farmed adjacent to Greenbrier Valley, began noticing strange movements at night. Caldwell had a habit of checking his cattle in the early hours of the morning, and on more than one occasion he spotted dim lights coming from Knox's barn, accompanied by those metallic sounds that had been mentioned by others. But there was something else, something that made him particularly uneasy. On certain nights, when the wind blew in the right direction, an odor would drift toward his farm that he described as similar to that of an abandoned slaughterhouse under the blazing sun, but with something else, a sickly, sweet note that turned his stomach. Caldwell shared his concerns with other residents, but most chose not to get involved. The mentality of the time in the Appalachian Mountains was one of self-preservation. People minded their own business and avoided unnecessary conflict, especially with someone with Knox's physical reputation. Furthermore, there was a practical dependence. Knox provided an essential service to the community, and breaking with him would mean traveling considerable distances to find another competent butcher. In July of that year, an event would change the course of history. An itinerant preacher named Ezekiel Morrison arrived in the region, driving a modest wagon and offering sermons in exchange for meals and shelter. Morrison was in his 50s, with graying hair and a presence that inspired confidence. Unlike the previous travelers who had disappeared, Morrison was known in several Appalachian communities, having established a network of contacts over years of traveling the mountains. His absence would be quickly noticed. Morrison spent 3 days preaching in the village of Hillsborough, where he was hospitably received by the local congregation. On the 4th day, he announced his intention to visit isolated farms in the Greenbrier Valley, bringing the sacred word to those living far from churches. Several people warned him about Knox, suggesting he avoid that particular property. But Morrison, driven by a sense of pastoral duty, insisted that everyone deserved the opportunity to hear his messages, regardless of their reputation. On the morning of July 17, 1878, Morrison set off for the valley. Witnesses last saw him around noon, his wagon following the dusty trail that led to Knox's property. When he didn't return after 5 days, the Hillsborough community was on alert. Unlike previous cases, this time there were people willing to take action. Morrison was loved and respected, and his disappearance could not simply be ignored. A group of 12 men, led by Henry Caldwell, and including Sheriff Driscoll himself, assembled to investigate. On July 23rd, they rode to Knox's property under the blazing afternoon sun. What they found upon arrival was a scene of apparent normality. Knox was working in his main butcher shop, processing what he said was pork. He greeted the group with cool politeness, denying having seen any preacher in recent days. He allowed them to inspect his main butcher shop and the area around the house, where everything appeared to be in order, although that characteristic smell lingered in the air. Driscoll asked about the barn at the back of the property, a dark wooden building partially hidden by a rise in the ground. Knox hesitated, claiming it only stored personal tools and equipment and that the structure was locked. When Driscoll persisted, Knox claimed he had lost the key weeks ago. Tensions escalated. The men demanded the door be broken down, and Knox, realizing he had no choice in the matter when faced with 12 armed men, finally relented, producing a key he said he had found only moments before. What happened next was recorded in several subsequent accounts, though the specific details vary. When the barn door opened, the group was greeted by an odor so intense that several men immediately recoiled, covering their noses and mouths. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the light streaming through the door. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they began to make out shapes hanging from hooks in the ceiling, shelves filled with nondescript objects, and, in the back, a large stained work table surrounded by cutting tools of various sizes. Driscoll ordered flashlights brought. What the light revealed paralyzed even the bravest men in the group. There was no denying what they were seeing, though their minds struggled to process the information. There, in that isolated barn in the mountains of West Virginia, Abel Knox had constructed something that stretched the limits of moral understanding. The specific details of what they found were deliberately omitted from subsequent official records, described only as irrefutable evidence of crimes against humanity. Knox attempted to flee at that moment, taking advantage of the confusion and shock that had gripped the group. He ran toward the trees surrounding his property, demonstrating surprising agility for a man of his build. But Henry Caldwell, recovering faster than the others, fired a warning shot that echoed across the mountains. Knox stopped, realizing he stood no chance against 12 armed men in open terrain. He was captured and tied up, shouting incoherent rants about needs and methods that no one wanted to understand. The capture of Abel Knox set off a chain of events that would reveal the true extent of his exploits in the West Virginia mountains. While Knox remained in makeshift custody on the property, tied up and guarded by half the group, Sheriff Driscoll and the other men began a meticulous search of the land. What they discovered in the following hours would paint a disturbing picture of years of secret activity in that isolated valley. At the back of the property, partially hidden by dense vegetation, they found a well Knox had dug years earlier. Its depth was estimated at about 15 meters, and when they lowered a lantern tied to a rope, the light revealed personal items at the bottom: suitcases, tools, clothing, and documents that clearly belonged to different people. Among the items identified was the sample case of Thomas Wardell, the hardware merchant who had disappeared in the winter of 1877. They also found the wallet of Jacob Brennan, the lumberjack, which also contained a few dollars and a photograph of his family. Inside the main house, which Knox kept organized and relatively clean, they discovered a locked trunk under the bed. When they forced it open, they found a diary written in irregular, sometimes difficult to decipher handwriting. The entries dated from 1876 to weeks before the capture. The contents were disturbing not for the description of acts, but for the cold, calculated reflections on techniques, timing, and methods Knox had developed over the years. He wrote like someone documenting scientific experiments, showing no trace of remorse or humanity. The diary also revealed information about Knox's past. He had indeed worked in Kentucky slaughterhouses during the 1860s, where he learned meat processing techniques that he would later adapt for sinister purposes. It mentioned being expelled from a town called Lexington after accusations that were never formally filed, but which forced him to seek increasingly remote areas. West Virginia, with its isolated valleys and scattered communities, offered the perfect setting for someone who wanted to operate away from prying eyes. Among the diary's pages were also lists of names. Some corresponded to known victims, but others were unknown to local authorities. This raised the terrifying possibility that the actual number of missing people was significantly higher than the 6 or 7 documented cases. Knox had been meticulous in recording dates and details, but he used codes and abbreviations that made his notes difficult to fully understand. Later scholars would attempt to decipher these codes, but many secrets would remain buried between the lines. As the investigation continued on the property, messengers were sent to neighboring villages to report the capture and request the presence of regional authorities better equipped to handle a case of such magnitude. The news spread quickly throughout the mountains. Within days, dozens of people began converging on Greenbrier Valley, some seeking answers about missing relatives, others simply driven by the morbid curiosity that such extraordinary events arouse in human nature. Jacob Brennan's wife, a woman named Sarah in her 30s, arrived accompanied by her 2 brothers. Upon learning of the discovery of her husband's wallet, she burst into tears that echoed across the mountains. She had spent over a year without knowing Jacob's fate, alternating between hope and despair. Now, faced with the confirmation that he would never return, her grief was palpable and moved even the most hardened men present. Knox, throughout this time, remained silent. Sitting on the ground with his hands tied behind his back, he stared blankly into the distance. When someone occasionally tried to question him, he responded with monosyllables or simply ignored them. There was a profound disconnect with the reality around him, as if he didn't understand or care about the gravity of his actions. This coldness deeply disturbed those who observed him, as it went against all emotional logic expected of a human being confronted with their transgressions. On the 3rd day after the capture, a representative from the West Virginia state government arrived in the valley, a man named Jonathan Pettigrew, who served as an assistant district attorney. Pettigrew was about 45 years old, experienced in criminal cases, and had a reputation for meticulousness. He spent 2 full days examining all the evidence collected, interviewing witnesses, and trying unsuccessfully to extract some sort of confession or explanation from Knox. What he concluded was that they were dealing with one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in that region of the country. The question now was what to do with Abel Knox. In 1878, the judicial system in West Virginia was still developing, especially in rural and mountainous areas. Pettigrew ordered Knox transferred to the county jail in Marlinton, the county seat of Pocahontas County, where he would await trial. The journey there would take approximately 2 days, traversing dangerous trails and crossing rivers that at that time of year had unpredictable water levels due to summer rains. The transfer was scheduled for dawn on July 30th. A group of 6 armed men, including Sheriff Driscoll and Henry Caldwell, was assigned to escort Knox. The decision to make the trip so early in the morning had a specific reason: to avoid crowds. There was a growing sense of anger and revenge among local residents, especially those who had lost loved ones. Pettigrew feared that an attempt at mob justice might occur if the transfer were made at a time when many people were on the streets of the villages. The night before the transfer, an unexpected event occurred that would completely change the outcome of this story. But before we get there, we need to understand the mood that had settled over the region. Greenbrier Valley, once a tranquil place where families worked their land in peace, had become a symbol of fear and betrayal. People looked at each other with renewed suspicion, wondering how something so monstrous had happened so close to them without them noticing. The trust that sustained these isolated communities had been shaken to its foundations, and it would be years before anything resembling normalcy returned to those mountains. The night of July 29, 1878, was marked by a storm that descended upon the mountains with unusual fury. Lightning streaked the dark sky, momentarily illuminating the valleys and gorges, while thunder echoed between the peaks like war drums. Rain fell in torrents, turning trails into mud and streams into raging rivers. It was the kind of storm that drove even the bravest to seek shelter and pray for the morning. Knox was being held in a storage shed on Henry Caldwell's property, a few miles from his former residence. The location had been chosen for its security and proximity to Hillsborough, making it easier to leave at dawn. 3 men were on guard that night, taking turns in 4-hour shifts. The prisoner remained in the far corner of the shed, still tied up and under constant surveillance by at least 2 guards at any given time. Around 2 in the morning, at the height of the storm, one of the guards noticed unusual movement outside. Through the cracks in the shed's wooden walls, he could see torches approaching despite the heavy rain. He immediately woke the other 2 guards, and they readied their weapons. What they feared was coming true. A group of local residents had decided that Knox didn't deserve to see a court. About 20 men surrounded the shed, some carrying torches protected from the rain, others wielding rifles and farm tools. At the head of the group was a farmer named Daniel Morse, whose sister had disappeared 2 years earlier while traveling through the region. Morse had never been able to confirm whether she was one of Knox's victims, but the possibility consumed him. His voice choked with emotion and pent-up rage, he demanded that the guards hand over the prisoner. Sheriff Driscoll, who had been awakened and rushed to the scene upon hearing of the commotion, attempted to negotiate. He positioned himself between the group and the warehouse door, arguing that the law should take its course, that Knox needed to face a proper trial where all the evidence would be presented and justice would be served. His words, however, met with little response from men whose lives had been marked by loss and fear. Tensions rose as Morse stepped forward, rifle in hand, declaring that the law had failed them by allowing Knox to operate undetected for so long. He argued that years had passed while people disappeared, and that authorities had done nothing effective to protect them. Now, he maintained, it was up to the community to do what the justice system could not, ensure that Abel Knox never again posed a threat to anyone. Driscoll knew he was outnumbered. His 3 guards and he himself would stand no chance against 20 determined men. But there was something greater at stake than Knox's life. If he allowed mob justice to prevail, he would set a dangerous precedent for the entire region. The law, however imperfect in these isolated mountains, was the only thing standing between civilization and utter chaos. It was then that something unexpected happened. From within the warehouse, Knox's voice echoed for the first time in days. He didn't shout or plead. In a calm, cool tone that contrasted dramatically with the storm raging around them, he simply told them they could do whatever they wanted, that he wasn't afraid of death, and that their actions had been necessary in ways they would never understand. Those words, laden with a frightening indifference, caused a momentary silence even among the most furious. Morse reacted with a shout of rage, declaring that Knox didn't even deserve the right to speak. He advanced toward the shed door, but Driscoll stood his ground, placing his hand on the butt of his revolver. The sheriff made it clear that he would shoot anyone who tried to get past, that he would not allow a lynching on his watch, regardless of the personal consequences. The standoff lasted for long minutes under the pouring rain. The men in the group talked among themselves in hushed voices, weighing their options. Some began to question whether they really wanted to carry the weight of a lynching on their consciences. Others argued that this wouldn't be murder, but rather necessary justice in the face of such heinous crimes. The group's internal divisions began to become apparent. It was Henry Caldwell who finally broke the deadlock. Emerging from the darkness, soaked to the skin by the rain, he positioned himself beside Driscoll. Caldwell had credibility among these men. He had been the one who first warned about Knox and led the search that resulted in his capture. When he spoke, everyone listened. He said he fully understood their anger, that he himself had lost sleep over what had happened so close to his land, but he argued that becoming like Knox, even by a single act, would mean he had somehow won, that he had corrupted not only the flesh, but also the spirit of that community. Caldwell's words struck a chord in several members of the group. The rain was beginning to ease, and with it, apparently, the fury that had brought these men here. Morse remained for a few more minutes, staring at the shed door as if he could look through it and reach Knox on the other side. Finally, with a grimace of frustration and pain, he turned and began walking back toward the village. One by one, the others followed, until only a few distant torches marked his retreat down the muddy trail. Driscoll let out a deep sigh of relief. He knew they had narrowly escaped a tragedy that would have permanently stained that community, but he was also aware that the situation remained dangerous. Knox's transfer needed to happen quickly, before another group formed, perhaps more determined and less open to reason. When day finally dawned, bringing with it a clear sky that contrasted sharply with the night storm, preparations for the journey accelerated. Knox was placed in a reinforced wagon, still tied up, and now also shackled with chains Driscoll had sent for in Hillsborough. The escort was increased to 10 men, all armed and alert. They would leave immediately, without waiting for more people to wake up and eventually decide to prevent the transfer. The journey to Marlinton would be long and treacherous, especially after the storm that had made the trails nearly impassable in some sections. But Knox had to be removed from the area before the situation spiraled out of control. As the wagon train began to move, leaving Greenbrier Valley and its dark secrets behind, few could have imagined that Abel Knox's story was far from over. The trip to Marlinton proved as challenging as anticipated. The trails winding through the Appalachian mountains had become veritable traps after the previous night's storm. Entire stretches were covered in thick mud that reached the horses' knees, forcing the group to repeatedly dismount and push the wagon manually. Downed trees blocked passages, requiring detours that added hours to the journey. Streams that could normally be crossed easily now ran fast and dangerous, requiring extreme caution. Knox remained silent throughout the journey, sitting in the back of the wagon, staring blankly at the mountains that passed by. Occasionally, one of the guards would try to strike up a conversation, driven by a morbid curiosity to understand the mind of someone capable of such acts. But Knox rarely responded, and when he did, it was only in disconnected fragments that explained nothing. He spoke of needs that transcended common morality, of a logic he had discovered in the shadows that the outside world would never understand. Around noon on the first day, the group stopped for a rest near a small stream. As the men took turns drinking water and checking on their horses, Henry Caldwell approached Driscoll with a worried expression. He had noticed smoke on the horizon, coming from the direction they had started. Driscoll peered through old-fashioned binoculars and confirmed there was a sizable fire apparently in the Greenbrier Valley area. They couldn't be sure, but both immediately thought of Knox's property. The suspicion was confirmed days later when messengers brought news. The morning after the group left, local residents had set fire to Knox's property, completely burning down the house, the butcher shop, and especially the barn that held so much disturbing evidence. They claimed they were purifying the place, ridding it of the evil that had been perpetrated there. The sheriff understood their motive, but also recognized that important evidence had been lost forever, documents and objects that could help identify other possible victims or reveal more about Knox's years operating in the shadows. The journey continued, the group growing weary. On the afternoon of the second day, they crossed a particularly isolated region of the mountains, where there was no human settlement for dozens of miles. It was there, amid a narrow gorge surrounded by cliffs soaring over 100 meters, that Knox finally spoke at length. His voice echoed off the rocky walls as he described how he had chosen Greenbrier Valley precisely for its isolated geography, how he had studied the travel patterns of people in the region, identifying which routes were the loneliest and which travelers were least likely to be quickly sought after. The men listened in horrified silence. Knox spoke without emotion, like a merchant explaining the advantages of a particular location for his business. He mentioned that he had operated elsewhere before West Virginia, a valley in Kentucky, that he abandoned when he began to feel he was attracting too much attention. He suggested that before Kentucky, there were other places, other mountains, where he had engaged in similar activities. If he was telling the truth, the full extent of his crimes could be far greater than anyone imagined. Driscoll ordered Knox to silence, unable to bear this cold, calculated account. But the words had already been spoken and would haunt those men for years. The idea that Knox had honed his methods over possibly decades, shifting from place to place as needed, painted the picture of an extremely adaptable and patient predator. This was not an act of momentary rage or sudden madness, but rather something planned and executed with terrible deliberation. By dusk of the second day, they finally spotted the first buildings of Marlinton. The town, the county seat of Pocahontas County, was larger than the villages they had left behind, with about 500 permanent residents and a more developed infrastructure. It had a proper jail, built of solid stone and wood, designed to hold prisoners safely until their trials. It was there that Knox would await the legal proceedings that would determine his fate. The arrival caused an immediate commotion. News of the capture had already reached Marlinton via messengers traveling faster than the heavy wagon, and a considerable crowd had gathered near the jail. Men, women, and even some elderly people lined the streets, wanting to see for themselves the man about whom so many horrific stories circulated. Driscoll ordered his men to form a protective cordon around the wagon, preventing anyone from getting too close. Knox was led into the jail under gazes filled with hatred and fear. The warden, a man named Augustus Fleming in his 50s, had prepared the most secure cell in the facility, located in the basement of the building, windowless and with a single solid iron door. Fleming had worked in that jail for 23 years and seen every kind of criminal, but he later admitted that there was something different about Knox, a lack of humanity in his eyes that deeply disturbed him. Jonathan Pettigrew, the assistant district attorney who had examined the initial evidence in Greenbrier Valley, arrived in Marlinton 2 days later. He brought with him Knox's diary and other documents that had been saved before the fire, including lists of names and dates that would need to be scrutinized. Pettigrew set up shop in a temporary office near the jail and began preparing his case for the court. The challenge was immense. Although there was abundant circumstantial evidence and the testimony of 12 men who had seen the barn, there was no formal confession from Knox, and technically, no body had been found that could be definitively linked to him. The judicial system of the time demanded concrete evidence, and Pettigrew knew he would have to build a case that left no room for reasonable doubt, even before a jury that would certainly be biased against the defendant. Meanwhile, Knox remained in his underground cell, fed twice a day and under constant surveillance. Fleming kept a detailed record of the prisoner's behavior, noting that Knox spent most of his time sitting motionless in the darkest corner of the cell, occasionally muttering unintelligible words to himself. He showed no interest in food, eating only the bare minimum necessary to survive. When asked if he wished to receive visits from a spiritual advisor, he categorically refused, stating that he had no interest in religion or any kind of redemption. The following weeks saw Marlinton become the center of attention for the entire region. Journalists from larger cities began arriving, drawn by the extraordinary nature of the case. The local newspaper, the Pocahontas Times, devoted entire pages to the story, publishing interviews with witnesses and speculation about the upcoming trial. Some of these reports exaggerated details or fabricated information, contributing to an increasingly tense and expectant atmosphere. Abel Knox's trial was scheduled for October 12, 1878, exactly 3 months after his capture. The date was no accident. Pettigrew needed time to consolidate the evidence and locate witnesses who could corroborate the documented disappearances. Furthermore, he hoped that the passing weeks would cool the public's heated emotions, allowing for a more rational process, less susceptible to emotional interference. The Pocahontas County Courthouse was a modest 2-story building, constructed of dark wood with a facade that attempted to emulate the neoclassical style of large eastern cities. It seated about 80 people, but on the morning of the trial more than 200 gathered outside. waiting for the chance to witness what was already being called the Appalachian mountain trial of the century. The judge assigned to the case was Cornelius Hartwell, a 62-year-old man with extensive experience in criminal cases, known for his impartiality and for conducting the proceedings with almost military rigor. Knox was brought from the jail under heavy guard, walking through the streets of Marlinton as hundreds of eyes followed him. He wore simple clothes provided by the jail, as his own had been burned along with his property. His hair and beard had grown during the months of incarceration, giving him an even more wild and disconcerting appearance. He walked with measured steps, unhurried, occasionally glancing out at the crowd with that same blank expression that had become his trademark. Jury selection took 2 full days. Pettigrew and Knox's defense, represented by a local attorney named Marcus Whitmore, questioned dozens of potential jurors, trying to identify those who might be even remotely impartial. The task was nearly impossible, as virtually everyone in and around Marlinton had already formed opinions about the case based on the circulating accounts. Finally, 12 men were selected, most of them farmers from more distant regions who had only a cursory knowledge of the events. Whitmore had agreed to defend Knox not out of sympathy, but out of professional duty and a fundamental belief that even the most despicable defendant deserved adequate representation. He was a 43-year-old man, a University of Virginia law graduate who had returned to the mountains from which he came to practice his profession. He knew that defending Knox would destroy his reputation locally, but he also understood that the judicial system only worked when both sides were competently represented. The trial officially began on the morning of October 14th. Pettigrew opened with a speech lasting nearly 2 hours, outlining for the jury the chronology of the disappearances, the discovery of Knox's property, and the evidence collected. He avoided graphic descriptions, focusing on objective facts, dates, names, objects found, and testimonies. He presented Knox's diary as central evidence, reading selected excerpts that, although coded, clearly indicated systematic planning and documentation of criminal activity. The 12 men who had participated in the initial search of Knox's property were called to testify. One by one, they recounted what they had seen that July day. Henry Caldwell spoke of the months of observation that preceded the search, of the strange odors and nighttime sounds. Sheriff Driscoll described Knox's initial reluctance to open the barn and his behavior after his capture. Each testimony added a layer to the case Pettigrew was building, a case based not on a single conclusive piece of evidence, but on an overwhelming accumulation of clues that pointed in the same terrifying direction. Whitmore pursued his defense with a risky strategy, but perhaps the only one available under the circumstances. He argued that, although the evidence appeared damning, there was no definitive proof that Knox had actually murdered anyone. The personal belongings found could have been acquired in other ways. Reports about the barn's contents were vague and subjective, influenced by shock and a negative bias against his client. Without identifiable bodies, Whitmore argued, the case remained in the realm of speculation, however sinister that speculation might be. It was a line of defense no one expected to work, but one that technically had legal merit. Whitmore himself seemed uncomfortable presenting it, aware that he was defending the indefensible more out of principle than conviction. The jury listened with expressions ranging from incredulity to revulsion, but Whitmore persisted, fulfilling his professional duty to the end. On the 5th day of the trial, something extraordinary happened. Knox, who had remained completely silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly stood up and asked to speak. Judge Hartwell, after briefly consulting with his attorneys, granted permission, warning Knox that everything he said would be recorded and could be used against him. Knox nodded and began speaking quietly, forcing everyone in the courtroom to lean forward to hear him better. What followed was a nearly 40-minute account that left the courtroom utterly silent. Knox didn't explicitly confess to any specific murder, but he spoke at length about his philosophy, about how he had come to view human beings differently than most. He described a moment of revelation he had had years earlier, working in a Kentucky slaughterhouse, when he realized that the line separating humans from animals was more tenuous and arbitrary than society cared to admit. He spoke of efficiency, of exploitation, of secrets he had uncovered over the years. He showed no remorse or apology. Instead, he seemed intent on sharing insights he considered valuable, like a professor presenting academic findings. The coldness with which he spoke was more disturbing than any explicit confession could have been. Several members of the jury visually shrank in their seats, while others clenched their fists so tightly their knuckles turned white. When he finished, Knox simply sat back down and returned to his usual silence, as if he had merely fulfilled an obligation to clear up misunderstandings. Pettigrew didn't need to do anything else. Knox's own words had sealed his fate more effectively than any physical evidence could have. Whitmore, visibly shaken, declined to ask additional questions or present closing arguments beyond a brief statement reiterating that, technically, no specific admission of wrongdoing had been made. The jury retired for deliberations on the afternoon of the 6th day. They returned after just 3 hours, a surprisingly short time given the gravity of the case. The verdict was unanimous on all charges: guilty on 6 counts of murder, guilty of criminal conspiracy, and guilty of concealment of evidence. Judge Hartwell, maintaining his professional composure to the end, scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing time to prepare the necessary documentation. Knox received the verdict without showing any visible reaction. He was escorted back to jail as dusk descended on Marlinton, while the crowd outside the courthouse erupted in shouts of approval and relief. But among those who had followed the trial closely, there was a lingering sense of unease. Knox had been convicted, yes, but his final words echoed in everyone's minds, suggesting depths of evil beyond common comprehension and raising disturbing questions about how many other places he had operated before arriving in Greenbrier Valley. The sentence was handed down on the morning of October 21st, 1878. The courtroom was once again packed, with people filling every available inch and many others standing outside, waiting for the news to reach them. Judge Cornelius Hartwell entered the room with his usual solemnity, carrying carefully prepared documents that would formalize Abel Knox's fate. The silence that fell was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional creak of chairs and the sound of nervous coughs. Knox was brought into the courtroom shackled at the wrists and ankles, the chains clanking with each step. His face remained expressionless, but those watching closely noticed a distinct glint in his eyes, something that could be interpreted as curiosity or perhaps grim satisfaction at the drama he had provoked. He stood beside Marcus Whitmore, who seemed to have aged years in recent weeks. The weight of Knox's defense having taken its emotional toll, Hartwell began methodically reading each of the charges and their corresponding verdicts. His voice was firm and clear, filling the courtroom with the authority of the law. When he reached the sentencing itself, he paused deliberately, looking directly at Knox before uttering the words everyone had been waiting to hear. On 6 counts of first-degree murder, Abel Knox would be hanged to death. The execution would take place on November 15, 1878, exactly 25 days after the sentencing, as stipulated by West Virginia law. The crowd in the courtroom erupted in reaction. Some applauded openly, only to be immediately rebuked by the judge who demanded absolute order in his courtroom. Others simply nodded in silent approval, feeling that justice would finally be served. Among those present were family members of the victims, including Sarah Brennan, the widow of the missing logger, who covered her face with her hands and began to cry tears that mixed relief with renewed grief. Knox, upon hearing his sentence, showed no outward reaction. He simply continued to stare at the judge as if listening to information about the weather and not about his own imminent death. Hartwell went on to explain that Knox would have the right to appeal the sentence, as guaranteed by state law. However, he made it clear that, given the nature of the evidence and the unanimity of the verdict, he considered it unlikely that any higher court would reverse the decision. Whitmore, true to his duty to the end, stated that he would consult with his client about the possibility of an appeal, although his body language suggested he had no real hope of success. Knox was returned to his cell in the basement of the jail, where he would spend his final days. Warden Augustus Fleming received specific instructions from Hartwell to maintain constant surveillance over the prisoner, preventing any suicide attempts that might deprive him of the public execution he had been ordered to perform. Fleming established a system of guards that rotated every 4 hours, with at least 2 men always observing the cell through a small opening in the iron door. The following days were marked by a strange atmosphere in Marlinton. The town had become the center of regional attention, with visitors arriving daily from distant locations, all eager to be present for the execution. Inns and guest houses quickly sold out, forcing many to camp on the outskirts of town or seek lodging on nearby farms. Local merchants saw their sales increase significantly, a temporary prosperity built on the tragedy and the morbid curiosity that such extraordinary events arouse in human nature. During this period, Knox received a few controlled visits. Pettigrew went to the cell on 2 occasions, attempting to obtain additional information about possible other victims or other locations where Knox might have operated. He hoped that, faced with certain death, Knox might feel some need for a full confession or to provide closure to the families still seeking answers, but Knox remained as enigmatic as ever, answering questions evasively or simply remaining silent for long periods, forcing Pettigrew to eventually give up on extracting any useful information. A local Methodist pastor, Reverend Thomas Ashford, visited Knox multiple times, offering spiritual counsel and the opportunity to make peace with his Creator before facing final judgment. Ashford was about 55 years old and had dedicated his life to reaching out even to those society considered beyond redemption. His conversations with Knox would last for hours, but upon leaving the cell, Ashford always wore the same expression of frustration and restlessness. He shared with Fleming that it was like speaking to a void, that there was no spark of spiritual or moral recognition within Knox that could be reached. Sarah Brennan requested permission to visit Knox, wanting to confront him directly about her husband's fate. Pettigrew and Hartwell debated at length whether to allow such a meeting, weighing the potential therapeutic benefits for the widow against the risk of exposing her to further trauma. Eventually, with considerable reluctance, they granted permission, stipulating that the visit would take place with guards present and that it would be terminated at the first sign of excessive disturbance. The meeting took place on the afternoon of November 3rd, 12 days before the scheduled execution. Sarah entered the holding area, accompanied by Sheriff Driscoll and her older brother, a burly farmer named Michael, who had insisted on being present. Knox sat on a rustic bench, the only furniture besides a narrow cot. When Sarah came into view, he slowly raised his eyes, regarding her with the same disconcerting coldness that had marked all their interactions. Sarah began speaking in a shaky voice, asking directly if Knox had killed Jacob Brennan. She wanted to hear it from the man himself, wanted some kind of confirmation that could finally close the painful chapter of not knowing. Knox was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Then, in a voice devoid of any emotion, he replied that he didn't remember specific names, that there had been many over the years, and that they all eventually became indistinguishable in his memory. The answer, or lack of a real answer, broke something inside Sarah. She began to scream, not coherent words, but pure sounds of pent-up anguish and fury. Michael had to hold her back, preventing her from throwing herself against the cell bars. Knox continued to watch the scene without any change in his expression, as if he were witnessing a distant natural phenomenon, and not the direct cause of her suffering. Driscoll quickly led Sarah out of the jail area, while she continued to sob uncontrollably. That incident convinced authorities that they should not allow any further visits from the victims' families. The remaining days until the execution would pass with Knox seeing only guards, Fleming, occasionally Whitmore discussing final legal matters, and the persistent Reverend Ashford in his futile attempts at spiritual salvation. Knox spent his days in his cell in contemplative silence, occasionally writing on scraps of paper Fleming had provided him, though the jailer carefully checked each entry, fearing that Knox might be documenting more confessions or leaving disturbing messages. Knox's writings during this final period proved disappointingly banal. They consisted mainly of observations about the conditions of his cell, comments on the food served to him, and abstract philosophical musings that provided no real insight into his motivations or history. It was as if, even in the face of death, Knox refused to give society the satisfaction of understanding him completely. He would remain an enigma to the end, keeping his deepest secrets locked away in some inaccessible corner of his fractured psyche. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Marlinton, preparations for the execution were underway. A gallows was erected in the town's central square, a temporary but solidly constructed structure designed to function efficiently and quickly. The designated executioner was a man from a neighboring town, someone with no local connections, who could perform the task without the emotional burden a Marlinton resident would carry. Tests were conducted with sandbags approximating Knox's weight, ensuring that the fall would be calculated correctly to cause instant death, as required by the humanitarian guidelines of the time, however ironic the concept of humanity seemed when applied to someone like Abel Knox. As November 15th approached, the tension in Marlinton grew palpable. It was as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting for the moment that would finally close this dark chapter of its history. But among those who knew the most intimate details of the case, a lingering unease remained, a sense that even with Knox's death, not all the questions would be answered, not all the ghosts exorcised from the Appalachian mountains. Dawn on November 15, 1878, arrived shrouded in dense fog descending from the surrounding mountains, covering Marlinton with a grey, damp blanket. The weather seemed appropriate for the event that was about to unfold, as if nature itself recognized the gravity of the day. From the early hours of the morning, crowds began to gather in the central square, filling every available space around the gallows that loomed somberly against the overcast sky. Later estimates suggested that between 800 and 1,000 people were present, an extraordinary number considering the region's relatively small population. They had come from all directions, some traveling for days to witness the execution. Merchants set up makeshift stalls selling food and drink, transforming the event into something bordering on a macabre affair. Entire families attended, although authorities tried to discourage the presence of very young people, arguing that it was not a spectacle appropriate for all ages. In jail, Abel Knox had been awakened before dawn. Fleming entered his cell accompanied by 2 guards, informing him that day had arrived. Knox received the news with the same indifference that had characterized his behavior throughout his incarceration. He calmly rose from his cot, accepted water to wash his face, and allowed the guards to check his chains. A final meal had been prepared, as per tradition, consisting of fresh bread, eggs, bacon, and strong coffee. But Knox ate only a few pieces of bread, declaring he had no appetite for the rest. Reverend Ashford arrived around 7 in the morning to spend his final hours with Knox, offering prayers and trying once again to reach something human in the man who would soon be gone. Ashford had brought his heavy, worn Bible, opening it to passages on forgiveness and redemption, and reading aloud, while Knox sat with his eyes closed. It was impossible to tell if he was truly listening or simply blocking out the world around him, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Around 9 o'clock, Marcus Whitmore made his final visit. He brought documents confirming that the automatic appeal had been denied by the West Virginia Superior Court, as expected. Whitmore looked exhausted, the months of defending Knox having left visible marks on his face. He asked if Knox had any final statements he would like recorded, any words he wished to leave for posterity. Knox thought for a long moment before replying that he had nothing to say that hadn't already been said during the trial. Whitmore waved, packed up his papers, and said goodbye, leaving with an expression of barely concealed relief at finally being able to bring his participation in this terrible case to a close. At 10 o'clock, Sheriff Driscoll and 6 deputies entered the cell to retrieve Knox. The execution time had been set for 10:30, allowing enough time to lead the prisoner through the streets to the central square. Knox was handcuffed again, with chains on his wrists and ankles, and a black hood was prepared to be placed over his head when the appropriate moment arrived. When he emerged from the jail, the sun had finally begun to penetrate the morning mist, casting pale rays through the dispersing clouds. The walk to the gallows covered 3 blocks through Marlinton's main streets. The crowd along the route was so dense that additional guards were needed to keep a passageway open. People's faces displayed a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that justice was being served, horror at what Knox represented, morbid curiosity, and, in some cases, profound sadness that human beings were capable of such acts. Knox walked with measured steps, staring straight ahead without focusing on anything in particular, his expression unchanged, even when some in the crowd shouted insults or curses. In the central square, an area had been cordoned off around the gallows, keeping the crowd at a respectful distance but still allowing a clear view of what was about to occur. Judge Hartwell was present, as were Pettigrew, several local officials, and several people who had played important roles in the case. Henry Caldwell was there, as were other members of the original group who had uncovered the truth about Knox. Sarah Brennan had also decided to attend, accompanied by her brother Michael, feeling she needed to see the end of this story with her own eyes. Knox was led to the steps of the gallows. The executioner, a middle-aged man wearing a hood that concealed his identity, waited at the top of the platform. Reverend Ashford climbed beside Knox, still murmuring prayers as the prisoner was placed over the trapdoor. The crowd had become eerily quiet, the previous noise giving way to a tense silence, broken only by occasional coughs and the sound of the wind blowing through the streets. Driscoll read the full sentence aloud, his voice echoing across the square. He declared that Abel Knox, having been found guilty of 6 first-degree murders by a jury of his peers and sentenced to death by hanging by Judge Cornelius Hartwell, would now be executed as mandated by West Virginia law. He asked if Knox had any final statements. For a moment it seemed Knox would remain silent until the end, but then, surprising everyone, he began to speak. His voice was low but clear enough for those closest to him to hear. He didn't ask for forgiveness or express remorse. Instead, he spoke of how society was hypocritical in its condemnation, how everyone shared the same dark impulses, but most simply lacked the courage to acknowledge them. He asserted that he was simply more honest than others in accepting his true nature. His words drew murmurs of indignation from the crowd, and Driscoll quickly interrupted him, signaling the executioner to proceed. The black hood was placed over Knox's head, plunging him into darkness. The rope was adjusted around his neck, the knot carefully positioned according to technical specifications that would ensure a relatively quick death. Reverend Ashford retreated a few steps, crossing himself and muttering a final prayer. The executioner moved toward the lever that would release the trap door. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Nothing happened. Then, with a metallic clang, the lever was pulled. The trapdoor opened and Knox fell through. The sound of the rope suddenly pulling taut echoed across the square, followed by absolute silence. Knox's body swayed slightly beneath the platform, the movements gradually slowing until they ceased completely. The local doctor, who had been assigned to confirm the death, approached after waiting the appropriate amount of time. He checked the pulse and other vital signs before officially declaring Abel Knox dead. It was 10:37 in the morning of November 15th, 1878. The crowd began to slowly disperse, many in contemplative silence, others talking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. There was no celebration or commemoration. There was a general sense that something necessary had been done, but it didn't bring the kind of satisfaction many had hoped to feel. Sarah Brennan lingered longer than most, staring at the gallows even after Knox's body had been removed and taken to be buried in an unmarked area on the outskirts of town, far from the cemeteries where decent people were laid to rest. That night, Marlinton was eerily quiet. The inns and taverns that had been crowded in the previous days now saw their patrons departing, returning to their homes and communities. The town began the long process of trying to return to normalcy, knowing it would take time for the shadows left by Abel Knox to finally dissipate. Fleming, as he locked the empty cell in the jail basement that night, felt a chill run down his spine, as if something evil still lingered in the dark corners of the space where Knox had spent his final days. In the days that followed, newspapers across West Virginia and neighboring states published accounts of the execution. Some described the event in dramatic detail. Others focused on the moral and legal implications of the case. Abel Knox's name began to enter regional folklore, becoming synonymous with evil in the Appalachian Mountains. Parents would use his story for generations to scare their families into staying on familiar trails and avoiding strangers. But among those who knew the true details of the case, there remained a lingering unease about what Knox had hinted at, but never confirmed, that his activities in West Virginia were merely the latest chapter in a much longer and darker story. The months following Abel Knox's execution brought a series of disturbing discoveries that would confirm the worst fears of those involved in the case. Jonathan Pettigrew, unable to simply close the case and move on, had devoted his free time to investigating the vague clues Knox had left about his alleged previous crimes. The assistant district attorney felt a deep responsibility to the families who potentially still didn't know the fate of their missing loved ones, scattered across other mountains and valleys Knox had frequented throughout his life. In early December 1878, Pettigrew traveled to Kentucky following references found in Knox's diary. His first stop was Lexington, where county records confirmed that a man named Abel Knox had indeed worked in a local slaughterhouse between 1863 and 1868. Even more disturbing, Pettigrew discovered in the local sheriff's files reports of 3 unexplained disappearances during that period, all of them lone travelers who had last been seen near the area where Knox worked. The sheriff of Fayette County, Kentucky, a man named Robert Cunningham, aged approximately 55, vaguely remembered Knox. He described him as an efficient but disturbingly reserved worker, someone other employees avoided for reasons they couldn't clearly articulate. Cunningham revealed that Knox had abruptly left Lexington in 1868 after unofficial accusations that he was selling meat of dubious origin. The accusations were never proven or formally recorded, but they were enough to prompt the slaughterhouse owner to fire him and strongly suggest he leave the area. Pettigrew spent weeks combing through old records and interviewing long-time residents in communities around Lexington. He found circumstantial evidence of at least 5 disappearances that could be connected to Knox, though after so long, no definitive proof was forthcoming. The families of these presumed victims had mostly dispersed or passed away in the intervening years, but those Pettigrew managed to contact were devastated to learn they might finally have an explanation, however horrific, for losses they had carried unanswered for more than a decade. Following additional clues from the journal, Pettigrew traveled further west into the mountainous regions of eastern Tennessee. In a village called Gatlinburg, he found accounts of a traveling butcher who had operated in the area for a few months during the year 1862. The physical descriptions matched Knox, though the name used at the time was different: Abel Morrison. Pettigrew discovered that 2 local hunters had disappeared during this period, both last seen dealing with the mysterious butcher who maintained a secluded camp on the slopes of the Smoky Mountains. The trail took Pettigrew even further back in time. In court records and church records, he traced mentions of a man who might be Knox back to the year 1857, working in small slaughterhouses and isolated farms across multiple states. It was like unearthing layers of a dark history that stretched back more than 2 decades. Each locality had its unexplained disappearances, its whispered rumors of strange odors or peculiar behaviors, but never enough evidence for legal action until it was too late, and the suspect had already moved on. Pettigrew's work culminated in a comprehensive report he submitted to the governor of West Virginia in late January 1879. The document suggested that Abel Knox could have been responsible for as many as 23 disappearances over approximately 21 years, operating in at least 5 different states. The actual number, Pettigrew warned, could be significantly higher, as many disappearances in rural areas were never officially reported, especially involving vagrants, itinerant workers, and others living on the margins of society. The report caused a stir when excerpts were leaked to regional newspapers. The idea that such a prolific predator had operated for so long undetected shocked the public and raised serious questions about the effectiveness of law enforcement in remote areas. Editorials in newspapers in Charleston, Richmond, and even more distant cities discussed the need for better communication between counties and states, more systematic reporting of missing persons, and increased surveillance of individuals exhibiting suspicious behavior patterns. Meanwhile, in the Greenbrier Valley, where everything had been discovered, life was slowly returning to normal. The burned-out ruins of Knox's estate remained a grim reminder, avoided by most travelers who preferred to take long detours rather than pass near that cursed place. Henry Caldwell, whose farm adjoining it, reported difficulty retaining hired hands, as many refused to work so close to where so many horrors had occurred. Eventually, Caldwell would sell his property and move to a different area, unable to live with the memories of what he had discovered. Sarah Brennan, Jacob's widow, never fully recovered from the loss. She spent the next few years living with her brother Michael on his farm, rarely leaving and avoiding any mention of what had happened. Those who knew her said something vital had been extinguished in her that day she confronted Knox in jail and received only cold indifference in response. She would die of pneumonia in the winter of 1883, at just 36 years old, and many in the community would say that Knox had robbed her not only of her husband, but eventually of her very will to live. Reverend Ashford, who had spent so many hours trying to reach Knox's soul, became increasingly reclusive after the execution. In his sermons, he occasionally referred to having gazed into the abyss and seen a complete absence of divine light, experiences that had made him question fundamental things about human nature and the existence of absolute evil. Some members of his congregation were uncomfortable with these dark reflections, preferring a more comforting theology. Ashford would eventually retire from active ministry in 1880, spending his final years in solitary contemplation. Marcus Whitmore, the attorney who defended Knox, suffered significant professional consequences. Although many intellectually acknowledged that he had only done his professional duty, his association with Knox tarnished his reputation. Clients began seeking other lawyers, and Whitmore found himself increasingly ostracized from social circles in Marlinton. In 1881, he moved to Pittsburgh, starting a new practice far from the mountains, where his name was indelibly linked to the most notorious case in regional history. Jonathan Pettigrew, paradoxically, saw his career flourish. His meticulous work investigating the full scope of Knox's crimes established him as an authority on serial murder cases, a term that didn't yet formally exist, but was beginning to be necessary to describe predators like Knox. He would eventually be named West Virginia's top prosecutor in 1883, a position he would hold until his retirement. However, in later interviews, he would always describe the Knox case as the most disturbing of his long career, something that haunted him decades later. Judge Cornelius Hartwell continued to preside over the Pocahontas County Court until his natural death in 1887. In his later years, when asked about the most memorable cases he had tried, he always mentioned Knox, not for the legal complexity, but for the sheer horror of confronting such a complete absence of humanity. Hartwell would say he believed in the possibility of redemption for almost everyone, but that Knox had shaken that belief to its foundations. Augustus Fleming, the jailer who had guarded Knox in his final days, developed a nervous habit of repeatedly checking the locks and chains in the jail, even in empty cells. Other staff noticed how he avoided the specific cell where Knox had been held, always assigning others to clean it or use it when needed. Fleming would retire in 1885 and reportedly would never set foot in that jail again, even for casual visits. The effects of the case reverberated beyond the people directly involved. In isolated communities across the Appalachians, people became more cautious, more suspicious of strangers. The kind of casual trust that had allowed travelers to find shelter and meals on remote farms diminished significantly. Parents warned their adult children about the dangers of traveling alone, of accepting work with people they knew nothing about, of venturing into highly isolated areas. The relative innocence that had characterized mountain life was replaced by a darker, more constant vigilance. As the years turned into decades, the Abel Knox case gradually passed from living memory to the realm of history and folklore. Those who had witnessed the events firsthand grew old and passed away, taking with them details and nuances that would never be fully captured in written records. But the shadow Knox cast over the Appalachian Mountains would linger, transforming into something larger and more mythical than the already horrific reality had been. In the final years of the 19th century, local historians began to document the case more systematically, recognizing its importance as one of the first well-documented examples of a serial killer operating across multiple states. The term itself was not yet widely used, but the pattern Knox established, moving from place to place, adapting to different communities while maintaining his horrific practices, would become sadly familiar in future cases. Scholars of criminal behavior would begin to study Knox as an early case, attempting to understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed such a complete dissociation between outward appearance and internal reality. The Greenbrier Valley estate where Knox had operated remained abandoned for decades. The burned-out ruins were gradually reclaimed by the forest, with trees growing through the charred foundations and vines covering the last vestiges of the structures. It became a shunned place, with local stories claiming it was haunted by the spirits of those who had perished there. Hunters who occasionally passed through the area reported unexplained feelings of unease, though it was impossible to separate the psychological effect of learning the place's history from any genuinely supernatural phenomenon. In 1923, a young Charleston journalist named Thomas Blackwell decided to investigate the Knox case as part of a series on historical crimes in West Virginia. Blackwell traveled to Marlinton and the surrounding area, interviewing the few people still alive who had personal memories of the events. One of these interviewees was an elderly man who, as a child, had seen Knox led to the gallows. His memories were fragmented and possibly colored by decades of retellings, but they captured the atmosphere of terror and fascination that had dominated those days. Blackwell's work resulted in a series of articles published in the Charleston Gazette that renewed public interest in the case. For the first time, a younger generation who had not lived through the events learned about Abel Knox in substantial detail. The articles sparked discussions about how society dealt with such extraordinary crimes, the limitations of the law in rural areas, and the nature of human evil. Some university professors began including the Knox case in courses on criminology and American history, firmly establishing it in the canon of notorious 19th-century crimes. Interestingly, attempts to locate information about Knox's early life have always resulted in dead ends. There were no reliable records of his birth, parents, or childhood. It was as if he had simply materialized as an adult, fully formed with his disturbing characteristics. Some researchers speculated that Knox wasn't his real name, that he had assumed this identity at some point and deliberately erased his earlier past. This lack of origin only added to his mythic quality, transforming him into an almost ghostly figure who emerged from the shadows to wreak havoc before disappearing again. In 1958, exactly 80 years after the execution, the Pocahontas County Historical Society erected a small memorial plaque in Marlinton's Central Square. The plaque didn't mention Knox by name, but honored the victims of violent crimes perpetrated in this region during the autumn of 1878. The carefully neutral language reflected the community's continuing discomfort with its dark history. Not everyone approved of even this low-key commemoration, arguing that it was better to leave the past buried and not risk attracting the kind of morbid tourism that had developed around other famous crime scenes. Yet interest persisted. In the 1970s and 1980s, as modern serial killer cases dominated headlines, crime analysts frequently looked back to historical predecessors like Knox. His case was cited in academic books and documentary programs exploring the history of violent crime in America. Some of these treatments were respectful and informative, others sensationalist and inaccurate, but all contributed to keeping Abel Knox's name in public discourse more than a century after his death. Modern researchers, armed with technologies and methodologies that did not exist in the 19th century, occasionally expressed interest in re-examining the Knox case. There were discussions about possibly using contemporary forensic techniques to investigate the site of his former estate, though such proposals always faced opposition from local residents who preferred not to disturb the land. The ethics of literally and figuratively unearthing such horrors remained controversial, weighing the academic and historical value against the potential trauma to the community. What remains indisputable is the profound and lasting impact Abel Knox had, not only on the lives he directly destroyed, but on the collective psyche of an entire region. He demonstrated that the deepest evil could flourish even in the most remote and seemingly peaceful places, that human monstrosity did not require large cities or complex societies to manifest itself. In the isolated mountains of West Virginia, among communities that prided themselves on their simplicity and traditional values, Knox had operated for years, hidden in plain sight, protected by geography, isolation, and the all-too-human reluctance to confront the possibility of horror so close to home. The lessons of the case remain relevant more than a century and a half later. The importance of communication between authorities in different jurisdictions, the need to take disappearances seriously, even when they seem unrelated, the value of trusting instincts when something seems wrong about a person or situation, all of these were tragically highlighted by Knox's story. His known and unknown victims paid the ultimate price for the slowness with which these lessons were learned. Today, Greenbrier Valley is once again a tranquil place, its dense forests and majestic mountains offering little visible indication of the events that occurred there so many years ago. Travelers pass through the area unaware of its history, enjoying the natural beauty without realizing the layers of human tragedy buried beneath the serene landscape. Only occasionally, when local historians recount the old stories or someone stumbles upon dusty records in county archives, does the name Abel Knox briefly resurface, reminding those listening that the darkest chapters of human history often unfold away from the spotlight, in forgotten valleys and isolated communities where secrets can be kept for years, until finally, inevitably, they come to light. The story of Abel Knox remains one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in the Appalachian Mountains, a narrative that has been deliberately downplayed in many official historical records precisely because of its deeply unsettling nature. He was, as the title suggests, a man considered too evil for conventional history books, whose crimes defied the ability of people of his time to process and comprehend. And perhaps it is fitting that even now, with all our modern sophistication and advanced psychological understanding, Abel Knox remains largely an enigma, a shadowy figure on the margins of history whose true thoughts and motivations were carried with him to the unmarked grave where he was buried on that cold November afternoon in 1878. If you've made it this far on this journey through the darkest corners of American history, I hope you found value in learning about this disturbing yet important chapter of the past. Stories like Abel Knox's remind us of the depths human nature can reach, but also of the resilience of those who survive, and the communities that eventually heal, even if the scars remain forever. If this content piqued your interest, consider subscribing to the channel for more investigations into historical mysteries and cases that time has tried to forget. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this case, and if you know of other dark stories from American history that deserve to be told, I'd love to hear your suggestions. Until the next journey through the shadows of the past.